Welcome to the Report for Tiger Mountain, ladies and gentlemen. We've got our special guest at the undisclosed location, Mr. David Thrussell, filmed by the lovely Nickers. Stick around and listen. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are, Thruster. So, here we are about 6 weeks out from the US election. We've got all kinds of trouble in the world. We've got, long-range missiles going into Ukraine. We've got, strife in Israel-Palestine, obviously, and now they've started to attack Lebanon. So where do we want to start? What do you want to talk about, mate?
Oh, look, take your pick,
The election's a rigged day here. Do you want to go into that?
Oh, I'm certain of it, actually. I'm quite certain of it. If you want to zoom out, I know you have a different opinion, which is fine. Mm-hmm. But I would argue that if you zoom out of all of these elections, this whole political arena, if you zoom out a bit, they'll throw in this personality and that personality and whatever, but it always ends up the same. After every election, they always generally, almost unfailingly, pursue the same course of action that they were before. I'll give you an example. In the US sphere, George W. Bush, who in certain quarters, certainly in my quarter, was a very unpopular guy after invading Iraq and blah, blah, supposedly, and blah, 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 and all sorts of stuff. Then we're offered the solution to George W. Bush, which is Obama. Okay, it's going to be completely different. Change you can believe in, and all that rubbish. He's going to get us out of all these stupid wars and blah 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 blah. Okay, they insert this guy. The media's in rapture. Blah blah blah. Nothing essentially changes, does it? The course. But there was a disruptor.
There was a disruptor. I believe Trump was the disruptor. I believe they were legitimately upset by him. And that they were like, this is just weird. You know what I mean? It's not like they didn't have, a dozen ways to Sunday to still blackmail him. They had put a little agent inside his family, the Zionist Kushner, just in case this guy ever did take power, they wanted someone close to him to whisper in his ear, So it's not like Trump is not being compromised to some extent. But I do think that election was a surprise to them. And obviously, too, another thing is like, if all this didn't mean anything, why would they go? They go to so much trouble to try and control.
Distraction.
And you see them do it.
Distraction.
But they go to
the public.
Exactly.
Give the public a circus. Okay.
Yep.
Now you're talking about the 2016 election.
Yep.
Look, I'll grant you, it's theoretically possible. I suspended judgment, as you know, for a long time. It's theoretically possible. But I mean, let's zoom out. Perhaps that's just a higher level of this kind of occult theatre that I'm talking about. Maybe let's give them a disruptor. As a lightning rod. The forces
I know that theory.
Of dissension are growing. Let's give them a lightning rod, and
but
they can focus their energies.
The problem
Meanwhile, let's orchestrate this vast occult circus to harvest the energies of the public and distract them from the fact that we're circling them with all sorts of evil nonsense at the same time.
Yeah, maybe, but
that's my suggestion.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying it's not within the realms of possibility. I just think, though, that Trump, for whatever reason, was some kind of legitimate disruption. And we've talked about the 2024 election cycle, and obviously you have the belief that the two assassination attempts were staged. I believe they weren't; that they were legitimate attempts. But it doesn't mean that, for example, the people that shot at him, whoever they really were, I don't really believe they were necessarily those two people who were the actual kind of patsies. I mean, it might have been an intelligence agency that just nicked his ear, but that could be a warning. That could be, listen, mate, you're ready to pull your head in, or because the next one isn't going to miss, or whatever. So you know what I mean? I think that they do have an operational, for whatever reason. See, I think for example, from a Zionist perspective, Trump is okay because he's an ultranationalist. And if you look at Zionism is ultranationalism. So in a sense, you could see Zionists going, well, Trump ain't that bad, right? But from the globalist perspective, Trump is a nuisance. You know what I mean? Because he's a nationalist. He doesn't like a lot of the stuff, the mass immigration into Western countries, destroying which is essentially a bioweapon. You know what I mean? That's what mass immigration is. Because, for example, in England, there's all these immigrants, and that's all people want in England. You know what I mean? You can't even say it in England anymore. You probably can't even say it here. They're starting to reach out wanting to, they're going to take people out of foreign countries and, who say things against. All British people want is an end to mass immigration. That's all Brexit was about. And obviously that won, which was another miracle. And they won't allow it. And they say, that's because of colonialism.
Which in an odd way...
But it happens to Ireland, which was a victim of colonialism.
Well, which in an odd way does in fact prove my point. Because Brexit, the Leave contingent supposedly won that election.
Yep.
And you'll notice that none of these things that they wanted to put a stop to have finished.
Yeah, but see,
since then.
It doesn't mean that election win wasn't legitimate, though. It was a legitimate win. It's just that they were like, oh, well, we have to now sabotage it at the level of the deep state or the bureaucratic class.
Well, my argument, I propose a larger argument, really.
Or whatever. And everybody said no. And, the voice to Parliament. But you see them going ahead with it anyway. And again, I don't think it was because that vote was not a legitimate vote. I think the Australian public doesn't want it. But the globalist deep state, whatever, does want it. So in a sense that you are seeing, you're seeing legitimate political reactions against what's going on. It's just that when they happen, when there's a win, they sabotage it. That's what I think is going on. But obviously, you think it's at some next level that everybody's in on it, that Nigel Farage was in on it, and Donald Trump is in on it, Putin's in on it. And I think the problem with that thesis, David...
I don't think they're necessarily in on it.
Yeah, but the problem with that is that it creates a sort of sense of hopelessness that no one ever gets anywhere near the possibility of changing it. Now, I agree that they sabotage it. Totally, and that, we end up with the same thing anyway. But at least it shows some level of resistance. How do you address that problematic that... when you say that everything that Trump is...
I understand the morale argument, okay? I do understand that argument, okay? And but I do think ultimately we're best served reaching for the truth, aiming for the truth, no matter what it might be. I do think that we're best
What if that isn't true? What if Trump legitimately is trying to fight them and it's just being sabotaged at every level?
Well, it's possible. Yeah. I'll concede it's a possibility, but I'd have a lot of questions about it, and I have a lot of suspicions about it.
People say he was a Mason, but it was like everybody was a fucking Mason in the 70s and 80s. Like, if you wanted to succeed in business, it doesn't mean every Mason, I'm sure your parents were Masons, or my grandfather was a Mason. Doesn't mean I'm a fucking Mason, and I mean, most people who are Masons are not involved in satanic rituals, or whatever.
I understand, but I think we do have to zoom out and actually look at the results. So I would suggest, we can squabble about the details all we like.
Yep.
What actually matters is the bigger picture, okay? And the bigger picture tends to be that these globalist forces get what they want. They'll throw us a few crumbs of elections, whatever. And I do think we have to be careful, all of us, we have to be careful about being overly emotionally involved.
Yeah.
Because the best propaganda always works on our emotions. And always manipulates our emotions.
Yeah, but it's hard to be dispassionate about the fact that someone's attempting to wipe out humanity.
I understand that argument. But what I'm talking about is being emotionally involved in these political figures like Trump or Farage or whoever, Obama, blah, blah, blah. Being emotionally committed to these figures who I would suggest ultimately are just chess pieces on the board who are being moved around to some degree, to some smaller or larger degree.
You don't even have a piece on the board. How are you ever going to win? No, there's nobody on the board that you would say, that's a legitimate opposition. That person is really trying to do the right thing, unless you're hiding up in the country somewhere in the middle of nowhere. And you know what I mean? Like, there's a sense of hopelessness about that. Because technically, at a common sense level, if that is the case, just go along with it, which is what most people have done.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Because in a sense, it's like, well, this is happening.
I understand your argument, but I fundamentally disagree.
No, I know that, but
and I think, but for very simple reasons, some of the reasons are very, very simple indeed, is that you are far better served pursuing the truth rather than getting wrapped up in emotional distractions. So
well, first of all, you have no idea. How do you tell?
No, let me finish. If the truth of the matter is that we have no representation in the political realm, we're far better served withdrawing from that realm and focusing our energies in other areas
at a local
that are
level
more realistic. That's my argument.
Well, sure.
If that's the case.
I mean, obviously, it's one alternative, and I know that there are people who live that way and everything. I mean, I just think that what you can't give up completely on the political process, because it's just the very fact that they go to so much trouble to handmade the candidates they want into the positions of power shows that there is some danger there to them. Otherwise, they'd be just like, if it really didn't matter to them, and everybody was controlled, what would they care if Trump got in? Yeah, sure, let Trump get in. But there seems to be some hatred of him that goes way beyond just the fact that, I don't, like obviously, for example, with Bush and they were both approved by the deep state, right? Obviously. And they were, it didn't matter whether Gore won or Bush. But obviously they probably preferred Bush because they were going to push wars. So technically, at that level, Bush would operate better. You know. So anyway, I just think it's interesting, and
look, I think this is an absolutely reasonable discussion to have,
Yep.
and I don't mind arguing
Tricky
about
dicky,
it.
yep.
I think that's perfectly constructive and a perfectly reasonable thing to do. We have certain different views in this area, which is fine.
Yep.
You know,
But-
I do tend to pull out and see the whole thing potentially as an occult theatre kind of operation. You know, that's how I see it, and I would caution, and I'm saying this to you and myself and to the audience, that we just need to be careful of our emotional entanglements in various personalities.
But you sort of have an emotional entanglement to the idea that everything is controlled. You know what I mean? Like,
No,
like there
not
is
necessarily. But just let me make one more point.
Okay.
Okay. I do posit the argument that all of this, all of these personalities duking it out, blah,
Yeah,
blah,
yeah,
blah,
yeah,
blah,
I
blah,
understand.
assassination attempts, it all looks, if you pull back a bit, it all looks a bit like the wrestling. You know,
you said that, the heel. Yep.
Yeah,
no, that is true.
and
That's an
Trump
interesting
is
point.
cast as the heel.
Sure,
He's the
sure.
bad guy that some people love, and then there's the bland good guy that the other people love,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
they
yeah.
duke it out in the arena, and meanwhile the crowd goes mad, and they're completely distracted from the palpable realities of their own lives.
Yep.
And how
But see,
manipulated the whole thing is.
I think the other problem with the way you often look at it is that there's a sense of almost, and it's not like you've had this view like only recently. You've always felt this. You know what I mean? Like since when you did Snog, Lies, all these themes are there in the first album you ever made. 30 years ago.
Yes.
So it's like it paints a picture, and in a sense, this is almost like you paint a picture of this vast conspiracy that's so vast that it's impenetrable. You know what I mean? And that, in a sense, that's kind of almost counterproductive, because it's like, well, how could you possibly ever defeat if Musk is in on it and Trump is in on it and Nigel Farage?
Well,
and,
unsurprisingly, I disagree.
No, I know, but but it is a problem for your perspective.
I disagree with that as well.
Yeah,
Because I think you're best served by realism. So if that is the realism of the situation, don't kid yourself. Kidding yourself, clouding yourself in a fog of fantasy about heroes and villains is simply going to send you further from any kind of success.
I'm not saying there are not people who you would call controlled opposition. For example, in the freedom movement, there was that guy, Ricardo Bossi, who was a former military guy, and I have no idea for sure if he was, but he was suspicious. And then you've got someone like Avi Yemeni, who will talk about, gee, isn't it terrible that people were locked down, and then he'll go off to Israel and be like, isn't it great, we're killing 20,000 children? And it doesn't really connect to me that, what's going on in Gaza is like 1,000 times worse than what happened to us in Victoria. And how could he care about what happened to us in Victoria and yet cheer on what's going on in Gaza? It just doesn't make sense. So, I can understand.
I think for what it's worth, in my opinion, I think Avi is so obviously controlled opposition that he's actually a decoy.
Yeah. And he's an own goal. He's an own goal.
He's like the lighthouse over here that you can't avoid.
They're both
so you don't see
sort
the
of
other
own
ones.
goals, and but I do think it is problematic. Obviously, there are legitimately people that oppose this, and I think that we have to, think, well, there probably are people in power who also oppose it. For example, Elon Musk. I mean, people have said, he wants to put chips in people. Okay, he's a transhumanist. But, I've seen one of these Neuralink chips he's put into people, and this is a guy who's blind, or who hasn't got the use of his limbs, who can now use the internet. I mean, and it seems like when he's talking about that technology, it's voluntary. Now, if people want to put a chip in there because they don't have the use of their limbs, I would probably want that. You know what I mean? Like, I agree the technology is a bit suspicious, but I think there's a difference. And I think there are legitimately powerful people who are opposing it. And I think until they're almost obviously controlled opposition, we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. That's my only position.
I don't necessarily disagree entirely, but I simply would suggest that we're better served by being as realistic as possible, and not being sucked up and subsumed in emotional identification and emotional arguments. I do think we are in a situation where we are best served by having a lucid, clear-sighted identification of good and evil. And if we get wrapped up in the wrestling and the theatre of the whole thing, we're not gonna be very sharp about it, and we're not going to proceed in a clear-sighted kind of manner.
Yeah, we are caught up in a battle of good and evil. It's sort of reasonably pretty obvious, and and it's strange. You have strange bedfellows coming into this argument. You have people like RFK, who's a former Democrat. supporting Donald Trump, and Tulsi Gabbard, and even Elon Musk was sort of left wing not that long ago. I mean, he's Mr. Electric Vehicles. So it just seems like there appears to be, and it's not just like this is just happening at that level. It's happening all over. I mean, there's a large, and we both are on the same page. We both want to resist this, and you have a more, I guess, what you'd call grassroots, off the grid kind of view of it, and I have a more let's go with a kind of right-wing populism thing that sort of Trump is spearheading, and let's see where that goes. You know what I mean? But
I understand.
We're both on the same page, really.
I understand. I'm just a little wary. Of being.
No, I'm not saying you should
trapped
not be wary. You should be.
I do think it's I maintained as much balance as I could for as long as I could.
For example,
but I do think Trump is a trap. I think he's
the latest thing is that Iran wants to kill Trump, and now that immediately just makes me think. Because whenever you hear the word Iran is a threat, that means Zionism. That's
bullshit
simple.
detector.
Yeah, instantly. So the fact that now there's this plot. And again, that could be used as a thing like, there is a Iranian team after you, Trump, and they will get you unless you give us a war with Iran. And now, would someone like Donald Trump give them a limited war with Iran to get him as president? Yeah, probably. Trump would probably make that deal because he is transactional. He'd think, oh, well, I'll be able to, block the border, but I'll have to give him the war. Trump is like that, okay? And now, he's like that. That's not a conspiracy. He's like that. You only got to read his own art of the deal to see that he's transactional. If it didn't destroy the world and he could become president, he'd probably do it. You know what I mean? So anyway, there he is. So it's just, that's problematic.
That's far from ideal.
No, sure, but I think he sees things. He is opposed to what you call the globalist agenda, but he's not opposed to the Zionist agenda. I think you should be opposed to both, right? But, in a perfect world, but, what are you going to do? I mean, we're not living in a perfect world. And I wouldn't mind seeing the globalist agenda sabotaged. I'd like to see at least one of them sabotaged. Because otherwise, and I think they're both connected, obviously.
Look, there's all sorts of possibilities there. I do think when you're trying to get inside the head of one of these figures, like...
Yeah, of course, you can't.
You're reading tea leaves.
Of course,
and I would suggest that all of them... I'm not saying I know precisely because I don't, but all of them tend to have, they do all of them to one level or another have this figure, for example, of Jeffrey Epstein hovering in the background.
Yeah, we should talk about that. We've got Diddy come out. Diddy's just come out. And I mean, isn't it interesting? You got, Hollywood covers up Harvey Weinstein, covers up Jeffrey Epstein, covers up Diddy. And I mean, we're not talking about, just Justin Bieber got raped when he was 16 or whatever. This is like something that's been going on for 30 years. It's systematic, and it doesn't appear to be that unusual. Yeah. Because these three people are not the only people who are notoriously, you had Kevin Spacey there for a long time. It just seems to be endemic.
So I'm assuming there's an industrial blackmail system going on.
Yeah,
basically,
exactly.
And I'm assuming it works on multiple levels. Yep. So on the most pedestrian, small scale, it'll mean bribes, it'll mean peer group pressure, media pressure, and all these sort of things. And then on a larger scale, you'll have this industrial kind of blackmail operations happening. I'm sure that the same thing happens in Australia. There's probably multiple operatives in Australia, because Australia has, essentially zero journalism apart from independent journalists who don't have any resources. But as far as mainstream journalism goes in Australia that does have resources, it doesn't exist with a conscience.
Well, interestingly...
my point is that I don't doubt for a second that's happening in Australia, but we simply don't have any information about it, or very little information.
An interesting commentator is this guy, Eric Weinstein. I'm not entirely sure whether he's completely on the level, because after all, he's a Weinstein. But, he worked for Peter Thiel, who is connected to Musk. Him and Musk funded PayPal, but Thiel is a kind of conservative right-winger, but is connected to Palantir, which is connected to the CIA. Anyway, he's a commentator, and he is quite intelligent. It's worth listening to some recent interviews he's done. But he calls something like, for example, like Epstein or Weinstein, kind of anti-interesting, in the sense that, like, for example, the Epstein story, whenever, say, 60 Minutes does a story on it, it rates through the roof. So in other words,
people want to know.
Yeah, exactly.
People
a show like 60 Minutes is going to be great for their ratings.